Okay. Oh, that's. Can you hear that? Yeah? Okay. Morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks, everyone, for being here. My name is Jessica Aldred, and I'm the Ocean Editor at the Pulitzer Center. I'm really pleased to be hosting this event today at the Ocean Pavilion, together with Communications Inc. and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We feel quite privileged because we're the only communications journalism panel here, so we're very grateful that you've made the time to come. Today's session will examine the key ingredients for a successful ocean and climate story. Our panel will look at how different interest groups can work together to tell accurate but impactful stories, how these stories might reach our audiences, and some of the decisions behind which ocean stories might make the news. I'll just begin with some brief context before introducing our panelists and starting the main part of our session. We're going to have some time for questions at the end. So why are we here telling you about ocean reporting? Well, the Pulitzer Center began as a US nonprofit in 2006. But it's now a global organization that supports underreported issues with a program of journalism grants and fellowships, alongside education and public outreach. The center already had an incredibly successful model of collaborative journalism in its rainforest reporting initiative, and identified an opportunity to fund another critical environmental topic that is time-consuming, costly, and often dangerous. Earlier this year, we launched the Ocean Reporting Network, a unique fellowship scheme where journalists get to spend a whole year investigating or reporting on an in-depth story. And that level of time and investment is a rarity in journalism these days. But our fellows, whether they're freelance or from a newsroom, receive funding, training, and the support and guidance of dedicated editors. The 8 Ocean Fellows chosen this year, 2 of whom are with us today, represent a really diverse mix of regions, languages, outlets, formats, and experiences, and are covering topics from fisheries and aquaculture to pollution and desalination. I'll click to the slide in a minute so you can have a look at some of the examples, but journalists who also want to report on ocean issues can apply for Pulitzer Center grants, and these support individual rather than year-long projects. This year, we've had grantees reporting on coral reef loss and restoration in Florida and in Venezuela, on land reclamation and sea level rise projects in the Maldives, coastal communities that are being impacted by oil and gas exploration in South Africa, marine geoengineering, deep sea mining, and more. One of the projects we've supported with a grant that has really raised the profile of ocean reporting is Ian Abina's Outlaw Ocean project, which recently published the findings of a 4-year investigation into the extensive use of forced labor on board Chinese vessels and in seafood processing plants across dozens of outlets and in different languages. So with this model of grants and fellowships, we are aiming to expand and diversify the global community of reporters, editors, and outlets who are conducting investigations and publishing deeply reported ocean stories within a network that is continually growing and learning. My background is almost 20 years in environmental journalism, and I've specialized in ocean reporting, commissioning, and editing in the past 5 years, working with journalists covering impacts in many parts of the world. In this time, I've seen the profile of ocean issues rise steadily up the news agenda, and more reporting resources finally being channeled in this direction. What was once a niche topic now sees significant breakthroughs like the signing of the UN Biodiversity and High Seas Treaties, the 20-year battle to end harmful fishing subsidies, and the ongoing negotiations on a plastic waste treaty now regularly making the mainstream news. At the same time, I think public awareness of the threats to ocean issues has really grown, and there are active campaigns mobilizing people around issues like the protection of the deep sea and tackling plastic pollution. The ocean now plays a far more prominent role in COPs, to the point where we have our own space to explore these issues. Whether you think it's too far from the center or not, we can debate afterwards. But this year's headlines about record ocean temperatures mean more and more people are finally making the connection, I hope, between the ocean and climate change. We have more than enough experts in this pavilion to explain that connection far better than I can. But what we can talk about today is how critical journalism is here, explaining often complex science, showing the wonders of the ocean, highlighting the threats and examining some of the solutions, covering poorly understood and underreported topics, holding companies and governments to account, exposing crime and corruption, but mostly humanizing and telling the stories of the people, places, and species most affected. To do this, we need to raise the levels of ocean literacy across the industry so that more journalists can report on these topics. We need to build the capacity and reflect the diversity to be able to report from the places that are affected the most, and we need to better connect the stories with the storytellers. So these are some of the challenges and opportunities that we're going to be talking about in our panel today. So I'm just going to do a quick introduction. Aryn Baker is from Time magazine, and she is an Ocean Reporting Network fellow who's spending a whole year following the UN plastic treaty negotiations. She's reported from all over the world with Time in a career I'm very jealous of. And Eman Mounir is a freelance journalist who's reporting on for Muwatin, which is an independent media platform operating out of London and Paris, but she's based in Egypt. Ken Kostel is from Woods Hole, which also runs an ocean reporting fellowship, which is a week-long stint where you get to go to this institution and learn all about the ocean science they're doing, which I can highly recommend. I went in 2019. And Natalie Hart is from Communications Inc., which is an agency that's done extensive work to raise the profile of ocean issues on the environmental agenda. And certainly in the years that I was starting out on ocean reporting, they were the go-to place for experts and knowing what was going on. So we'll just get started with the panel now. Okay, so we're going to start with an open question because we can't come to a panel event like this and not answer that question first up. So what do we think makes a successful ocean and climate story? Why have stories that have been successful made a breakthrough? And what do we think is success? Is it impact in terms of a change of policy? Is it people reading our stories? Is it building capacity on the ground? What are some of the thoughts, just to begin with? Who'd like to go first?
Should I take... Oh, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm going to take that one. I'm going to be the annoying person that starts by picking apart the question. So as a communication strategist, one of the things I think about a lot is what do we mean by good and what do we mean by successful? And so when we're designing our communications approaches, we think in terms of measures of performance and measures of effect. So you could have a story about the ocean that goes viral and it gets tweeted and it gets hits and organizations are really happy because you've got all of these incredible numbers. But if it's not having the desired impact on the audience, if it's not connecting people to the story, if it's not giving them a sense of agency, if that's what was aimed for, a sense of mobilization, then the question is it a good story? So for me, I would say you want a balance between the two, and success is, yes, getting those ocean climate stories out there, but also getting them out there in a way that resonates with the population and kind of from a political perspective demonstrates a social mandate for ocean action, an appetite for change, and really kind of pushes the momentum forwards for political change from a population perspective.
I would take the journalist point of view, which is a good story answers this basic human need for narrative. For me, a good story is something, what I call a hey honey story. It's back in the days when we had newspapers, you pick up the newspaper, hey honey, did you know? Like, I want to pique that kind of curiosity, but I also think this deeply human tendency towards egotism also helps. People want to see themselves in the stories, or at least see how they might be implicated or affected. So these are all the kinds of things that we want to pull together to make a good, enduring story.
Yeah, I agree with Aryn. As an investigative journalist, I know I succeed when I make sure the voices of affected people heard loudly by officials and audience. This may, after investigation, after publishing the investigation, their life changed for the better, and maybe corruption or pollution. People can know about it more than it.
And thank you.
Okay,
I want to pick up on just two of the points, resonance and narrative. I think humans are inherently a storytelling species. You go to a party and it could be as loud as you can imagine. And if you say to somebody, let me tell you a story, the world immediately collapses around you. But then you have an obligation to fill that void. You have to be able to tell that story and continue to capture that imagination. And it can happen. And then the other point about resonance and also hearing something of yourself in that story, if you're at that same party and you're just walking past somebody and you hear your name, you immediately your attention immediately goes to what is happening in that person, with that person as you're walking by. And that speaks to that desire to see something of yourself in the stories and to maybe capture a little bit of surprise and unexpectedness in that moment. So getting to your point of that hey honey story.
So I think we could circle back to this later, but maybe another question we can come back to is, how do you do that if it's a really technical topic like marine carbon dioxide removal, geoengineering, what is happening in the High Seas Treaty? How do you make that relatable to being at party or hey honey? Because if I say to someone, I want to talk to you about MCDR, their eyes glaze over. So if it's not kind of humanizing, how can we get people or readers or journalists interested and reported in those things that are happening way away from us? We can answer it now.
I mean, I think it's through, if it's a technical story, I would urge a journalist to tell the story through the eyes and the words of the people who are out there trying to dig up the information. I see Ken Bissler and Sarah Das in the back. They both deal with very, very technical subjects. But if you sort of focus on the humanness of the desire to extract information from the world around us, to better understand the world around us and how we are influencing the world or the world is influencing us, it becomes a very human endeavor. It's trying to fulfill an innate curiosity in all of us. And I think that way you can make the reader see a little bit of themselves in the story and in the process add the technical details. The technical details are not the story themselves. There's something else. And that's, I think, in our previous discussions getting ready for this, we touched on that idea of the difference between a story and a subject. Yeah, this thing that we're seeing a lot of pitches come in for ocean stories where it's someone saying, I want to report about fishing in Mauritius, and that's really interesting, but that's not a story. It has to be, something to follow or something to expose or telling the story of how someone is impacted by something. It can't just be a general topic, and I think there's a way to go in terms of journalists pitching ocean stories, of thinking about how to really refine those story ideas. Natalie, maybe it's a good time to come to you, because one of the things that you wanted to talk about was how the High Seas Treaty was an example of a story that really broke through. And we've got Eman in the room here who's covered that for about the past however many years. And it's really something that's been in mainstream media quite prominently.
Yeah, thank you. So as part of my role, another thing that I do is I look back on media coverage and communications campaigns around the ocean to see what broke through. And this past year, it probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone that we really found the conclusion of the High Seas Treaty negotiations to be a massive moment for ocean coverage. So what we did is we did monitoring of online news coverage in English, Spanish, and French. And we also did an analysis of social media coverage. And we work with lots of civil society and ocean organisations, and I think there was a sense in the community that the story was going to be a bit of a home run because it was about protecting the ocean, right? And it's going to be this big win, and that will be the message that comes through. But what we actually found was a little bit different, in that the kind of prime message or angle on the High Seas Treaty was that it was a success for multilateralism. It was a success at a time of political fragmentation. It was a success at a time when there's, rightly a high level of skepticism around institutions like the UN. And so it wasn't first and foremost an ocean protection story. And then also coming back to Ken's point about the human face, it was also a very human story, because one of the most shared clips or images from negotiations was President Rainer Lee breaking down, crying at the end of these UN negotiations. And they seem, from the outside, so obscure, so hard to put a human face to. And I'm not saying that it's a recipe for success and we can't get Rainer to cry on demand when we want to get a story, but it made a difference. And then on social media, we also saw, compared to normal campaigns, a lot more people within the ocean community sharing this as a success from their personal accounts, so not organizational accounts. It was people being there and saying, I worked on this for 20 years, I've been sleeping like at the UN waiting for the results to come through. And that was incredibly powerful in a way that discussion about a legal framework is a little bit dry and might not be.
Thank you. So Aryn, I'm going to come to you now. You work for a very big, prominent media organisation. How have you managed to carve out a niche for ocean reporting within that newsroom? And how did you come to the topic personally?
I came to the topic personally with an offer from Greenpeace to take me on the Esperanza, go down to the Antarctic and count penguins. So I joined an expedition. Before that, I hadn't really followed ocean stuff at all. But I think I realized on that trip and in my subsequent reporting was that ocean is not siloed. I was able to report stories about conservation, about AI for counting penguins, and about oil and gas, and all of these things. Like they touched on almost anything that I would normally cover at time. And over the course of, that was 3 years ago, pre-COVID, I've been able to use the ocean to tell stories about other things. When we talk about how do you explain the technical details or why, warming ocean, for example, well, that impacts our weather. So I was able to talk about warming oceans by talking about the reason why you're having more turbulence when you fly is because of X, Y, and Z. So I think all of these things bring it together to make it relevant to the audience. The ocean is just a basket for me to draw from, but it can apply anywhere, I think.
And you were saying yesterday when we were talking that some of the stories that you found have been the breakthrough where there's been a connection to human health. And I think we've seen that in certainly a lot of the climate reporting, that there was real change when it was shown that it was damaging people's health. So how's that played out for you in ocean stories?
I think anything to do with human health, food, culture, lifestyle, like all of these things are the draw in. I mean, you can have a crying dignitary, or you can have oh, this could happen to me, or, oh, that happened to somebody I care about. So anything from food security. I wrote a story about native populations in Alaska who could no longer do hunting in the wintertime because there wasn't enough ice to do the walrus hunting that they needed to do. And these sort of things make it relevant when you start saying, like, all of a sudden, like, the food that you've relied on because you can't get anything else at a grocery store in northern Alaska, all of a sudden that becomes more relevant to an audience. And I think they can put themselves in the shoes of whoever I'm writing about.
And I think that also speaks to another point about success for reporting about the ocean, is that it doesn't appear in niche areas, but it appears broadly across every section of a newspaper, if people are still reading printed newspapers, or every, in fashion reporting or in business reporting or sports, because it can show up anywhere.
Yeah, there's I was at an investigative journalism conference earlier this year, and they had a special day dedicated to climate and environmental reporting, and that was one of the themes that came out, that it's great having siloed specialist desks that are environment correspondents or even an ocean correspondent, but you need to be embedding those that knowledge in the sports desk when they're covering the World Cup, or the arts desk when there's an oil protest. And I think that's the direction that newsrooms are starting to think of. Is that what's happened at Time, would you say?
Yeah, at Time we're a very small team. We're just 3 or 3.5, depending on how you count. But our whole idea of the climate desk is climate is everything. So we write about business. We write about leisure. I write about Taylor Swift with an environmental angle. Not an ocean one yet, but I'm working on it. Yeah, so climate is everything. And I think in many cases, ocean is everything. You can usually find an angle.
Yeah. Just one more question for you before we come to Eman, but your fellowship, you're following the negotiations for a plastic treaty. So how are you using what's happening at COP as a reporting opportunity?
I've been stalking the Fiji forum because I intend to go to Fiji to do some of my reporting. Here at all three floors here have been lots of resources for me, but also looking at the lobbying efforts that are going on here. There's huge parallels with the Plastics Negotiations Treaty.
So Eman, you are reporting on not only environmental ocean issues in the Middle East and North Africa, which is a region that we don't see a lot of environmental reporting from. What are some of the challenges that you face in reporting on ocean issues and getting that kind of interest and engagement?
Actually, we have a lot of challenges. We don't have networking. If you look in any place in the world, you will find networking for journalists. But in Middle East and North Africa, we don't have any network for ocean reporters, or actually not for climate reporters. Because of this, me and another two of my colleagues started to establish a network for climate and environmental journalists in our region. And we shocked because we just launched it 2 months ago, and our first event was before COP. It's called the Arabic Climate Week. Every day we had a webinar, and we had a guest, and we talk about different topic about ocean, pollution, food, everything. And we just had in this week like 500 participants from the region, and it's a big number. So people is very interested to know more about climate and environment in our region. The second thing for me as a challenge, as investigative journalist, also freelance, is funding. We don't have a lot of funding opportunity here, but I overcome of this because I work with another organization, a global organization like Pulitzer, and another organization, Health Journalism Network, and another organization. Also, thing I need to talk about is the gap between scientists and journalists. Here, scientists make a very good work, but we didn't hear about this. So I think we need to build a bridge between scientists and journalists, and to cooperate in our stories. For example, 2 weeks ago, I published an investigation about how sea level rise affected Nile Delta in Egypt. And in this investigation, I cooperated with a scientist who worked with me on extract data from geographic information system, using geographic information system. And after this, I analyzed the data, and I started to make the field work, and it's a very good story. I will share it with you. So I think the cooperation between journalists and researcher and scientists is very important.
Yeah, I think that networks and collaboration and kind of sharing of expertise is among journalists is a really promising model. I just want to pick up on what you said about access to experts. We've talked a bit about this, that journalists often don't know where to go. I think there's experts that are slightly scared of journalists. So Ken, you are kind of the bridge between those two spheres. How do you see that? Like, how can we improve that process so that we can get the information flowing freely?
I think it's to do something that we try to do internally, which is explain to the scientists how the endeavor of journalism operates, and be as honest and truthful about what the process is that you're engaged in and what your ultimate goals are. I mean, it's very, very difficult sort of in the breaking news sphere, because you're trying to hit a deadline, you're trying to get a quote. You know, maybe you already have the story half written. But I think by being better ambassadors of your craft, and being educators, being educators yourselves to the journalists of what you do and how you yourself do journalism is important.
Yeah, so I think panels like this are really important at COP, is making the whole process of how we cover it really transparent and accessible. Natalie, can you talk us through some of the work that you've done around engaging on ocean issues? You've done a lot of work around imagery and narratives and what kind of resonates with people and what can put people off. And that was something that was really new and interesting to me that I think would be really useful to hear more about.
Yeah, thank you. So we, as I said, we do various research projects, and between 2019 and 2021, we found this issue of imagery coming up again and again, and it was sort of a finding that was a byproduct to our research objectives. But we found it in our own media analysis, that a lot of stories we saw had stock imagery of ocean. So you'd have a really interesting ocean story, and then you get like a picture of a wave or something like that. We did interviews with journalists, and journalists were telling us that they were having issues accessing interesting ocean imagery. And we were also told it by the civil society community who were working on campaigns, and didn't have the funds and resources essentially to pay for the rights that they needed. So we worked with Climate Outreach on a project called Ocean Visuals. Climate Outreach already do incredible work on the use of images for storytelling, and they work with kind of photography best practice. They've done a lot of their own research, and on top of that, we did focus groups in Chile, Egypt, and Portugal, looking at people's responses to different kinds of imagery. The things that we found, so stock ocean imagery, like no surprise to anyone, just doesn't really create an impact. It doesn't create engagement. We also found that there's been the emergence of essentially visual tropes in ocean storytelling. So images like a creature with a plastic bag in the sea have sort of been overdone a bit now, and people have become a little bit desensitized to that kind of imagery. We also found a real lack of authentic images showing people in their own coastal ocean environments engaging with the sea in their own way, and the ways that people connect with the ocean are very diverse, right? And so there's a whole spectrum of imagery there. So we created a briefing with our guidelines on what we thought impactful ocean climate imagery looked like. We put out a call for imagery globally. We had over 1,800 images submitted from over 100 countries. And from that, we selected a bank of 100 images that we thought, based on our research, were most impactful. All of those photographers were paid for their work, and that bank of ocean climate imagery is now available free to use for educators, journalists, and civil society. And so that, we feel like we made a contribution with the 100 images, but actually the really important bit to come from it is the photography brief and the guidelines that we hope will kind of help people take a more evidence-based approach to visual storytelling.
So it's about thinking of the imagery that you use to accompany the story. So picture desks almost need to have that level of knowledge of climate and ocean or awareness as well. But Natalie, if we found a way to share that, because I found that really interesting and useful, because I think you're right, it's either a turtle or a seabird that's tangled in plastic, or it's a random picture of a wave, or I feel like a lot of the human ones are portraying people in not a very proactive way. It's almost like a victimization. So I think imagery is really key as well. So that's something to think about. So I just want to talk a bit about, for me, I think this year there's been a real increase in the level of ocean stories that have broken through and made the main news pages, or on the, as we keep talking about newspapers, don't we? Or social media, or on websites, and it's a lot about the record temperatures. So I just wondered, an open question, but maybe we could start with Ken. Why do you think those? I mean, it's obvious why those stories made a breakthrough, but is there a danger if it's only those type of stories that are being told? Are we missing other parts of the puzzle that maybe need to be reported as part of the ocean climate connection?
Yeah, I think, what you said about people becoming desensitized to those tropes, repeating any particular idea runs the risk then of that becoming a trope and people becoming desensitized to it. But with regards to the story about ocean warming, I think that is really the story that surprisingly didn't get as much or the right kind of play that I thought it deserved, because the amount of warming in the ocean this year was just mind-boggling. And one of the ways I think you can get around it, and this is really very difficult because heat in the ocean is not a thing you can interview. But we have a physical oceanographer at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution who works with a group of fishermen on the East Coast that form what he calls the Shelf Research Fleet. They work off the continental shelf of the Northeast U.S. And they gather data for him. They have some simple oceanographic instruments that they deploy and they gather data. But they also report back on what they're catching. And they're seeing an increasing number of tropical species up in our waters off of Cape Cod and Rhode Island. And they can say firsthand that, yeah, the ocean is changing in some really fundamental ways. Look what I found in my net. I have never seen these things in my net before. I heard another guy who caught this. That's nuts. And that's the kind of story that I think actually then makes a breakthrough to connect warming with somebody who's experiencing and seeing the changes firsthand.
Would you like to add anything? Well, maybe we can come to some of the idea of topics, because in terms of the proposals for fellowships and grants, the majority I see coming in are fisheries. And then there's kind of sea level rise, climate impacts, and obviously you are both doing pollution. I mean, how can we get more reporting on topics that I think are really interesting, like we've talked about, geoengineering, deep sea mining, the finance, the money that is going into some of these industries, aquaculture. How can we? Is there a way that you think that how can we get more stories on that, and how can we get more journalists being aware of these topics, do you think? It's a hard question, sorry.
Sure.
I'll give it a go.
Come on then.
So part of the work that we do, we have a network of around 100 NGOs, ocean NGOs globally, and we call that the Flotilla Network. And as a communications agency, one of the things that we try to do is connect storytellers. And so within the Flotilla, we built up a database of spokespeople to better connect not just the scientists, but also civil society with journalists. But also what we find useful is the collective voice and aligning messages and messengers to start getting things on the radar of journalists. So it might be that if, MCDR as an example, if there's one voice or one NGO talking about it might not be high enough up on the agenda, but when you kind of start getting more and more voices and it becomes a theme that's emerging, a trend, and then a story that's worth investigating rather than just a one-off thing that someone somewhere else is talking about.
Maybe Aryn and Eman, this is a good question for you, but if you were a journalist that wanted to start reporting on ocean issues, it can seem quite daunting, I think, maybe a bit scientific and technical and a lot of jargon. But you don't need to have environmental background to do an ocean story. Like, what are the other kind of journalistic beats that would lend themselves to ocean reporting, do you think?
For me, the first step to know something difficult for me, to talk with scientist who has a patient, who can talk with me and explain this technical issue. Because if I wanted to deliver this information for audience, I need to understand it first. So I think the first thing to talk with someone who has experience and has knowledge and has patience to explain these things for me.
I think I would want to see more engagement between scientific institutions and journalists. I think the Hui example of bringing ocean fellows for that week that sounds like a fantastic introduction, because I think there's a barrier for a journalist who's like, oh, I don't know anything about that. Like, I cannot risk the capital I need to get other stories in on something I don't know about. But if you can say, like, for me, going out with Greenpeace was another thing. Like, after that, I'm like, okay, I can do this. I can do this story. So I think that exposure, and I think we tend to think of like the big international institutions like WHOI, but every city, every state has a university that's got marine biology or something. So I'd love to see more engagement and outreach between institutions and local journalists to invite them, like, hey, come on in, we don't bite, this is what we're doing. I think there's not enough of that. Yeah. And I just want to touch one more thing that it's not exactly your question, but one of the ways that I have come up with stories is nothing like to me, but it is photography. Freelance photographers have gone to my photo editors, or perhaps through this project you talked about, and they presented a body of work. My photo editors are like, this is amazing. Aryn, go write a story about it. Yeah. And that has been sort of the most fruitful ways. So I think tapping more or funding more photography might be another way of originating stories.
Yeah, and working with different mediums, because I don't know if they're still here, but there's a postcard in the other room for this amazing podcast called The Catch, which basically follows squid fishing throughout the entirety of its supply chain, but it's hour-long episodes, I think. So but the detail and the engagement that the journalist gets from the people that she talks to is some of the best stuff I've heard. And also kind of the work that Aryn's done on climate and labour, the documentary form, and some of the grantees that were funding this guy who's in South Africa at the moment taking photos of communities. He's a photojournalist, so he's not out there writing about it. He's out there taking photos in different communities. And I think what I would like to see more of is more proposals of different mediums, because I think that's just as powerful as words. But just I think that the thing about the starting point, for me, I'd done stories about marine species and marine conservation, but I remember when I got the job of Ocean Special Projects Editor, just reading reams and reams of reports. But then I started to see who are the common names or institutions, and then going to conferences. I mean, there's so many good ocean conferences where, as a journalist, you can go and just learn, and you can get connections to the experts, and you start to see the same names, and then all of a sudden it kind of there's a bit of a breakthrough. But I think, if you're a finance journalist, we would love to see you coming and looking at the money flows that are coming into ocean from venture capital firms. I think there's loads of other beats that would be easily transferable. And if you've got those skills of a journalist, I think you can learn about the subject, but you can't, the learning to be the journalist takes a lot longer.
But I think, what we're talking about takes a phenomenal amount of skill, certainly, but also care and time and effort to dig really deeply and to find that nugget of the story, which is why I think what you're doing at the Pulitzer Center is really important, to give people like Aryn and Eman that space to dive deeply into a story. And there's no other way to do it but then to put in the hard work.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting as well among the fellowship, isn't it? There's some stories that are very much reported stories, and there's others which are data projects. And I think that use of data in ocean journalism has a really big potential role to play as well. Can we talk a bit about this idea of solutions journalism we talked about yesterday? So for a few years in journalism, there was a trend where you had to tell good news stories and everything had a solution and a happy ending. And I think that's just not the real world, is it? And there's not a silver bullet for everything. But I think there is a lot of talk, certainly at COPs, about the ocean being an ally in the fight against climate change and a potential solution. And a lot of the work that the high-level panel on ocean has done around sustainably managed resources. So there's the idea of, good news stories, so balancing those against kind of doom and gloom things, which is just going to make people feel disempowered. But then there's also solutions within the ocean to fight against climate change, which Natalie could talk about, and Ken. Then there's also scientific and technical solutions, which we've been talking about quite a lot here at the Ocean Pavilion. So maybe Aryn and Eman, can we talk a bit first about how you balance the doom and gloom versus optimism in our stories?
There is a push even now at time to promote solutions. It's ad friendly. it's positive, it's click-friendly, this one trick will save the planet. So I think there's a constant pressure to that. I'm a bit obstinate, so I tend to go like, here's a climate solution, and here's why it doesn't work, which pisses some people off. But I think like ocean mining was a huge example of that. Ocean mining was going to save the world, right? We were going to get batteries from the ocean. And it's like, well, hang on. So I think there's maybe a question of punching down these quote unquote positive solutions is one way. But I think now for engagement and getting people to care, it's not solutions that people want. It's not hope, but it's a sense of agency. What can I do? Can I pay attention to this? So I use, for an example, a story, like one of my most successful ocean stories was a profile of Enrique Sala. And I think what triggered there was like, here's one person, he's not offering one solution, but he has this idea, and he's managed to get people to embrace that idea and made real policy change. And I think that is what grabs people's attention. Not a solution, but a movement, perhaps.
For me, as investigative journalist, in investigative journalism, we focus on the issue, problem, and ignore the solution. Yeah. In 2021, I made an investigation about fish farmers in Egypt, how pollution affected fish farmers, and some of them go to prison because they go on debt, and there is no way to work in this industry again. When I made the field work, I met the daughter of the fish farmer, the owner of fish farmer, and this girl left the school because there is no money, and her father didn't have any money anymore, and she had to help him in the fish farm. After publishing the investigation, I sat with myself and think, why Eman? She is a child. You need to talk about solution. And after this, I tried to write another story about solutions. So I think solution is very important, not for us as a journalist, also for the audience or for the people who are affected and suffered from climate change. So the balance between solution and the problem is very important for all people.
Thank you. That's really good points. Natalie, this idea of the ocean being an ally in the fight against climate change is something that Communications Inc. has done a lot of work on. Why is that so important, do you think?
I mean, I think at the moment, as we search for solutions, not all solutions are created equally. And one of the messages that we've really been trying to push is that the ocean already does so much for us as a buffer against the worst effects of the climate crisis. And so we've been trying to work with messengers to help audiences understand that protection that you might think is protection for biodiversity's sake has a huge role to play in climate action as well. The baseline of public understanding is still very low, and there is work to be done. So specifically, for example, from a language point of view, there was a study done last year of 7,000 people in England, Wales and Scotland, and it found that 7% of the population said they knew and understood what carbon sequestration was, and 5% of the population said they knew and understood blue carbon. It's very low.
That's a way to go,
yeah,
isn't
we
it?
talk in these circles and we throw these words around, and a lot of people don't understand them. And so I think just being aware of the baseline and communicating in a way that people understand but also isn't patronizing towards them is very important.
So we need to keep reiterating in the stories things that we all know and feel like we have, coming out of our ears all the time, because that level of public awareness and knowledge is still really low.
Yeah.
Okay. And Ken, what about solutions in terms of things like ocean CDR removal? What do you think the messaging and the reporting is like around those issues?
I think it's just getting going, much as a lot of the MCD, marine carbon dioxide removal efforts are also getting going. But I think we're at a very interesting point in that there's an increasing push to say, in the general public, to say, hands off the ocean. The ocean is sacrosanct and inviolable, and we shouldn't be doing anything to endanger it anymore. But a lot of these large, if they are instituted, marine carbon dioxide removal efforts are going to look much worse than the problem they're trying to address, at least on their surface. But because we're going to be talking about putting iron in the water to stimulate phytoplankton growth to improve the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or adding alkalinity to make the chemistry such that it pulls more CO2 out of the atmosphere. But it's a little bit of a false equivalency, because if we say hands off the ocean, don't do anything to the ocean, then we're doing something to the ocean because the carbon dioxide is already in the atmosphere. There's a legacy of 150 years of emissions that's just sitting there already acting on the ocean. So what we're trying to do is trying to clean up our mess. Saying do nothing to the ocean from here on is like saying, okay, if there's an oil spill, then do we not clean that up?
I think it's really critical for journalists to be looking at these topics and representing both sides fairly and examining some of the arguments, rather than this kind of direct messaging with no filter. And certainly around those more controversial ocean topics, I think that's where I would like to see more reporting. So I think we've got just under 15 minutes, so I've come to the end of my question. So I'm happy to open to the floor if I think there's maybe a microphone somewhere. We can give you this one. Perfect. Would you like to go? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's okay. We'll come to you next.
Sorry, I didn't want to skip the line.
That's okay, go ahead.
Thank you for this very interesting panel and this discussion. My name is Sophie, and I'm from the Belgian government, and I've been involved for, well, probably what feels like 100 years of high seas treaty negotiations.
Thank you for your service.
I was probably one of those who was saying, like, please let me sleep a couple months ago. And regarding that, I was actually pleasantly surprised with the amount of media attention that got. And there were actually a lot of requests for interviews and quotes, etc. And so I have no communications background. I don't really know how to do interviews, etc. And what I noticed was that often in the articles that appeared, or when I was talking to journalists, there was this confusion between the High Seas Treaty, or the BBNJ Treaty, and 30 by 30. And often it was something like the title would say treaty adopted, that will protect 30% of the ocean, something like that. And then I'm wondering, I'm also from a legal background, and we sort of have the tendency to go to the nitty-gritty and not necessarily making it a nice story to tell. But so knowing this now, I'm looking at you. What do we do as experts or a government representative or something? Do we go to what extent do we correct and say, no, it's not like it's within CBD, but one will incentivize the other and allow for the other? I mean, how precise do we need to be, or do we need to correct, like send them an explanation to correct, or how do we go about that?
I think you should always get in touch if something is not right, and those things are really hard to get right, because there's the high seas protected areas and how they intersect. So here we go with like how technical and how many acronyms, how they intersect with RFMOs and 30 by 30. And to most people, they'll just not know what that means at all. But we have to explain how this is going to work in practice. So there is a level of technical knowledge and understanding that you have to have as a journalist. And I think organisations like the High Seas Alliance have been really good in doing briefings for journalists to explain these things. So I think if you're constantly seeing things that are wrong, then you should try to get in touch with a journalism organisation and maybe suggest to them that you do a briefing to explain these things, because I refer to Fermín again, but we've had this through all the stories that we've worked together on, and you can't, I mean, in a way it's not bad if they're kind of saying that they're getting things wrong and it's for a good reason, but I think there are some, and I see this a lot with illegal fishing stories as well, that, you know, they're saying something's illegal and it's like, well, okay, but what's the illegal part of it? And that they don't really know, and actually it's not technically illegal, but they think that because it's a bad practice, it's illegal. So I think in terms of governance and fisheries, there's still like some work that could be done by experts to explain it to journalists in a way that they can then understand to explain to their audiences. Does anyone else want to take an answer?
I think one of the things you can and should do, and everybody should do, is practice explaining what you do, why it matters, as succinctly and simply as possible, and the legal technicality or the individual technicalities of the points that you need to make. Practice explaining those as simply as possible, and making something simple doesn't mean making it wrong or dumbing it down, so to speak.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd just say that was something that we saw a lot in our analysis as well. And we did see within the first 48 hours quite a few corrections on that specific point. It is also difficult when there is something as great as a stat, right? Like, we know people like to have a statistic in a headline. It's suddenly made this confusing thing very accessible and easy to communicate. And I know you touched on this, Jess, but it's great to have media briefings beforehand. In this case, there was an emergency media briefing afterwards to really give journalists the opportunity to access the experts and kind of really figure out the nitty-gritty.
I think that's where we could also play a role, is organising things for other journalists. Like, we've certainly done a lot of how to report on this issue or how to report on that issue, and we would bring in an expert who would be able to talk to the journalists as well. I also think it's really hard for subs trying to get all of that detail into about 5 words of a headline. So some things are not always going to be there, but if the main part of the story is right, then that's really important. You had a question. Oh, hang on, we'll just hold on for the mic. You have. Yeah, we'll come to you next.
Thank you. So my name is Leticia. I'm a Brazilian journalist with the CCMP Fellowship from Earth Journalism Network. I'm really interested in writing about oceans, but I haven't much so far. So my first question would be, what are the metaphors we can and we can't use? For example, I've been hearing a lot about, if a frog is inside the water and the water is heating up, it doesn't feel. Actually, I've just found out it's false. So the frog does feel. So what are the metaphors we can and can't use? That would be one. I'm also really interested in the power that journalism has to change society in terms of legislation, regulation, and this kind of thing, like real effective impact. So when we write our stories, should we think about that firsthand, and how do we go forward after writing in terms of trying to achieve a real change? And the third question is, sorry, since I'm new to this field, and you said about the difference between story and subject, how can I find out stories to write about? What are the sources I could go to? Thank you.
They're all really, really good questions. If we don't get to all of them now, then come and grab us at the end. But I'm going to ask Eman and Aryn to maybe try and tackle 2 out of the 3.
Okay, I maybe talk about the second, the power of journalism. I think as a journalist, I always believe in my power of writing, of power of my investigation. Every investigation I did, I think maybe this investigation change people's lives, or change people livelihood, or save people's lives. In 2021, in 2020, I made my first investigation called the Black Beaches. It was about oil spills in a big oil companies in Egypt. And I was afraid maybe this investigation not interested to people, important to people. And after publishing the investigation, I shocked, because the investigation is spread worldwide, and the parliament talked about this investigation, and they punish the oil companies, and they also clean the beaches and give people money and these things. So I always think my investigation, when I write my investigation, I think this investigation maybe will be good for people. And after publishing the investigation, I will not able to be silent. I make a follow. I write every day. I write about it on my social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. I also maybe send the investigation to parliament people and the government. I can't be silent. I need to write more and more about the story. This story. Is it okay?
Metaphors. I would say just avoid cliches of any kind. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes when you're crushed for time, you pick one, but better avoid it. Or if you do use one, break it down, examine it a little. I didn't know that frogs didn't jump out of hot water either, so. And I've probably used that one before.
I'd say on the last one as well, one thing that we do at the network when we were at the Pulitzer Center when we were trying to find fellows is we were asking, what is the hypothesis for your story? So what are you seeking to prove? What data and sources and information and research are you going to use to back that up? And what kind of impact or results do you think would happen if your story was successful? So it's kind of, yeah, there's a big difference between that and just I want to report on illegal fishing in Kenya, because you need to look at who are the major players and who are the people and where are the kind of levers of power.
I would also, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, you can follow up with us afterwards.
I would also say as a journalist, if you want to write about the ocean, fine. Go to the beach, go to the docks, go talk to the fishermen. Like, ask a question. It doesn't have to be a story before you start reporting it. You can report to get the story. And sometimes those are the best stories because they haven't been covered by anyone else. So talk, ask, read.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Just really quickly, because I'm so excited, there's a question about metaphors. There's a brilliant report by the Frameworks Institute it was 2019, 2020, and they tested different types of metaphors to talk about the ocean-climate connection, with the caveat that metaphors are very linguistically and culturally specific. And they found that the most effective metaphor in ocean terms was a metaphor around the body and health, talking about the ocean as a body. Because there are lots of tropes around the ocean being so big and unchanging, but we know that ocean health can get worse, but just as it can get worse, it can also recover. And so the health metaphor was a really effective, impactful way in showing that change. I also have no idea about the frog one.
And also really quickly, just this idea that it's one ocean that is connected to all of us and we all have a stake in and we all have a role to play rather than it being separate oceans, which are just out of sight, out of mind. So that is kind of a metaphor as well. The gentleman at the back, maybe really quickly, and then maybe time for one more.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Mohammed. I am from the Somalia, Minister of Fisheries and Blue Economic. And as we know, aquatic food is a solution for the food security and the climate. And your target is for the research and data collection for the oceans. And we are a fragile country due to the prolonged conflict. And we have the longest coast in Africa. How can we do, or how can we get the data about the situation of our ocean? That is my question.
I think anecdotal evidence, so people's experiences, is just as important as data sets. And I can appreciate that in some parts of the world, data sets are non-existent or very hard to get. So I think people's individual experiences is just as powerful a story. Eman?
Yeah, actually, I make an investigation. It's about this situation mixed between two countries, and I was afraid how I can get the data. And when I talk with an expert, he helped me about data sources. He gave me a data sources. Also, I use the satellite imagery, and these things. It's very helpful to extract data in this situation.
Gentleman in the black shirt here, Sam, very quickly.
The panel's been excellent. It's been about ocean storytelling, but more specifically ocean protection and marine conservation storytelling. And I was wondering if there are storytellers or communications professionals on the other side making the case for, obviously for vested reasons, for exploitation of the world's oceans and so on? And if so, are there metaphors that they use? Are there techniques they use? And are there things to be aware of in that regard as to what resonates on the other side, as it were?
I definitely think Deep Sea Mining Campaign is very, very polished at that, but maybe you have some experience of plastics within like 30 seconds.
Plastics cleanup. We can clean up the problem. And look, Boyan Slat is doing some amazing stuff, but he has been used as a solution for plastic pollution because all we need to do is just wipe it off. I think that's another thing that's been used by major plastic polluters to say, like, we don't need to reduce our production.
Yeah, and with deep sea mining, this idea that, like, well, if we want to be green and transition to a low carbon economy and have renewables and have shiny phones, that we have to do that, and they've done a really good PR job on that. So I would say just be careful of some of those messaging. I think we're out of time, but can I just have a round of applause for our amazing panelists? I think it's been a really good discussion. Thank you. Thanks for coming as well, and feel free to ask us any more questions afterwards as well. Thank you.